Welcome, everyone. This is Regenerative Alternatives to Degenerative Work Practices, and today we have the pleasure of welcoming my colleague and dear friend, Jeff Su. Jeff is one of the managing partners of nRhythm, and he'll be sharing a little more about his story later on when we dive in. So I'm really excited. We have people from all over the world calling in today, from Mexico to Canada to the UK and Germany and Kenya, and we're just super excited that this approach to organizational design is getting interest from places as far away as that. So my name's Alex, and I'm a project manager within nRhythm. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we were founded in 2009, and we've been working with organizations and networks and collaboratives around the world on organizational design and development and operational management since then. And in 2016, we really began taking a regenerative approach to our work, which is what we're excited to share with you about today. And that largely started with an organization called the Savory Institute, who are best known for the restoration of grasslands around the world. So our team at nRhythm and our partners, we're really on a mission to transform how we work. And we recognize that organizations are living systems full of potential waiting to be released. So we're excited to share more about that with you today. We've been working with organizations in a variety of fields, from nonprofit to manufacturing to architecture, and we have a community of practice of over 50 practitioners and educators, and we offer things like online courses, health assessments, consulting services, and much more. And so Jeff will share more about that throughout the webinar. But a couple logistics before we dive into the good stuff. We've scheduled 60 minutes for today, and we'll save time for question and answers at the end. So please keep your questions coming in the chat, and I'll be sure that we can get to those at the end. And if you can't stay for the whole thing, or if you want to rewatch the webinar, you're going to have access to the recording and the slides tomorrow. And I know some of you are calling in by phone, and Phyllis, hopefully I'll be able to get your contact information just to shoot you over the slides so you could follow along either on your phone or on later on. So if you could all please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the comments. You can share your name, where you're from, and maybe how this webinar relates to your work. And our hope is that this can create some more connectivity among all of you. And yeah, so while Jeff is presenting, just keep your eye on the chat. We might post some questions to create some more engagement as well. And just be sure to keep yourselves on mute throughout to ensure optimal audio quality. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to kick off the webinar. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And thank you all so much for taking time today to join us. If you all feel comfortable and you have the internet capacity, it'd be great to see your faces, just so it feels less like talking into a dark black hole. It's nice to see people's reactions. Just a little bit about, thanks, Brett. Just a little bit about myself. I come at this work from originally as an ecologist and living systems thinker, and I've spent the last 20 years or so running organizations of all kinds, focusing on addressing ecological and social issues in our world. And this whole time have been thinking about how we apply learnings and understandings from living systems to human organizations. And I'm incredibly honored to be doing this work with the nRhythm team. It's in many ways a culmination of all of ours, and myself included, experience and wisdom, and this is definitely something we are really honored to try to bring into the world. And that is relates to this. Today will be a little bit of an introduction. There's a lot of more topics we could get into, so we'll touch on that and a bit of ways to connect with us in the future on that. And this, again, all of us, our mission at nRhythm is to really transform work, because we see how degenerative work and traditional work practices have been on the people and planet and communities, and we'll touch on that today. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll jump right in. So just a little bit about what we'll cover today in the webinar. We'll talk a little bit, starting off with what do we mean by degenerative practices? What do we mean by how the traditional workplace and traditional work organization is degenerative? And we'll address our learnings very briefly. We can dive into it deeper on a further webinar, what we mean by designing with living systems in mind. And a big part of this is the idea of working with principles versus best practices. We'll address that. And then finally give a quick introduction to our overall regenerative framework, which is how we look to co-design with our partners and clients. So I'm going to present a little bit of a thought model, and we're going to come back to this throughout the whole webinar. So if we think about starting with designing after living systems, then what we do is we draw from living systems, from our understanding of living systems and study of living systems. And this really informs a set of principles that we'll share today that we designed to. By designing in principles, this really allows us to facilitate the creation of very flexible frameworks to operate our organizations under, to make decisions, to create day-to-day structures and systems, to create the impact or create the service or product that we are in the world. And we see this framework as a way of regenerating health then and feeding back into living systems, regenerating the health of the organization. We'll talk about what that is, regenerating the health of our communities and regenerating the health of our planet. In contrast, our traditional organizational design is really that of designing after a machine or a mechanistic design, and we'll talk about what that is. And when we do this, then we really use that to engineer best practices and recipes for operations. And when we create best practices, we end up really trying to enforce those best practices, which ends up with what we call prescriptive structures or recipes, where we think we can just have a cookie cutter approach to creating solutions or addressing issues that come up in our organizations. And we'll talk today about how we really see that as ultimately degenerating the health of an organization and the health of the people working in the organization, and really creates a lot of impact on our communities and on our planet. So we'll keep coming back to this. And when we manage in this way, with a mechanistic model, ultimately we have to put more energy into that system to keep it running. A traditional agriculture system is a great metaphor, and a lot of wisdom that comes from that. We can keep generating yields of corn or wheat or rice, but we have to keep inputting more fertilizer and more external inputs to keep that system going. Versus if we really design with a living systems in mind and really regenerating the health of that living system, ultimately when we manage that system, less energy is needed, less inputs from the outside, where more of that management and more of that health is being regenerated within the system itself. And then ultimately, designing in this way, or approaching or redesigning organizations in this way, ultimately leads to some pretty significant shifts in our perspectives and on our behaviors and our operations of our organizations. So this is our overall model that we operate from, and we'll keep coming back to this throughout the webinar. So what do we really mean by degenerative work practices? As we mentioned, the sort of dominant metaphor of our organizations today is this idea of a machine. It's actually, we can see it how much it's baked into our language, right? We talk about a team needing to operate like a well-oiled machine. We refer to our own time as bandwidth. We refer to all kinds of things in this mechanistic way. And when we do that, then we end up treating employees as parts of a machine. And of course, if any of you have had a lot of used cars like I have, what happens when a part of the car breaks down? We simply go to a mechanic and we replace that part, which is great for our cars. But if we see people as replaceable parts, then we end up really just commoditizing people and really seeing them as expendable and replaceable. And this model or this metaphor is so pervasive, we see it everywhere. These are just a few random images I Googled. One is referring to your business as a machine, referring to the different departments in your business as cogs in a machine, and ultimately profit coming out the bottom of this machine. And here's an example of a conference in Georgia, treating the whole, redevelopment or development of Georgia's economy as a machine. We even refer to our own bodies as machines. This is actually a turn of the century image where we started thinking of our living systems as, different parts of a machine. That our lungs are like, bellows, and our arms are like cranes. And we are all seeing the different detrimental health effects of actually treating our bodies in this way. And what is the impact on the planet of operating? This is really pervasive of all of our human organizations. What kind of world are we creating? This is just one way to measure it, but we see a significant decline, of course, in species living around the world, and significant impact through climate change and other and habitat loss on the planet itself from operating in this traditional mechanistic way. And how are we doing with the people then? How are we actually running organizations? How are our organizations doing? This is a recent Gallup poll showing that actually only 13% of people consider themselves engaged at work. 63% consider themselves fairly unengaged, and actually 24% consider themselves actively disengaged, which actually means actively subverting the organization they work for in some way. And Gallup put a estimate of the cost of this, at least an economic cost to this, saying that this is probably costing the US economy between $450 to $550 billion in lost productivity a year. If we look at from an economic equality perspective, we see that this system has obviously now created a situation where we have individuals who have a higher net worth than whole countries. This is just a figure of the top 10 billionaires in 2016. This has obviously changed a bit. I think Mr. Bezos has moved up in that figure. And this is obviously a sign of extreme income inequality. And then from an equity perspective, despite all of our changes and advances in different countries, we still see that race is a major predictor of life expectancy, infant mortality, all of these different areas. Race will predict how well a person will do in their life in each of these areas. So with this machine metaphor, going back to our framework then, using this machine metaphor, we see the detrimental impacts of it. Let's focus a little bit more on about how this engineers best practices. This idea of a machine then is that we can replicate how it runs. And the issue with best practices is that we end up looking for solutions and treating practices as recipes or shortcutting processes. And we move away from designing solutions that are really relevant to the current situation or relevant to the local situation. Dilbert is a wonderful commentator on our modern workplace, and here's just one comic talking about best practices, saying, we will be adopting the best practices in our industry just like everybody else. And Dilbert saying, well, if everyone's doing it, aren't best practices the same thing as being mediocre? And the other issue with best practices, again, I've moved back to Massachusetts now, from Denver, Colorado, which is at 5,600 feet. And all of us who are into baking have recognized the difficulties of applying recipes, primarily that are created at low elevations. Trying to bake anything at a high elevation creates examples like this. Just a everyday example of how recipes need to be adapted to a local context. So creating best practices then, if we've created them, and especially in organizational context, we're pretty invested in them. And then we end up enforcing them across many different contexts and across many different situations. And ultimately, we become really vested in this, and we create what we call prescriptive structures. right? And this is where on vested interests, either from history or monetarily, solidify certain organizational structures, and we keep doing them even though they've outlived their purpose and their usefulness. This is a real example from a company I used to work for. This was the process to sign out a company truck. You had to obtain a key from a secretary to open a file cabinet to get a form to reserve the truck. Then you take that form, you brought it back to the same secretary to obtain another key to another filing cabinet to fill out a form that would actually allow you to drive the truck when it was your time to actually sign it out. Then you took that form back to the same secretary to get another key to a key closet to where the car keys were actually kept. So then you could actually go to your car or to the truck. Now this is pretty cumbersome in general, but actually this was being applied to one truck and two drivers at the time. And all of this was put in place for a situation that no longer existed. There used to be a fleet of 10 to 15 trucks and 30 or so drivers. And perhaps then the system made sense at that point. But certainly when we got to this point, it did not. And what was the justification for this? Well, it was always, well, we've always done it this way, and why change it? Which this is a pretty amazing person. This is Rear Admiral Grace Hooper, and a quote that she gave was, "The most dangerous phrase in our language is we've always done it this way." And she's definitely lived into this, this motto, in that she actually, during World War II, she pushed to enlist in the Naval Reserves at the age of 34 and had to get an exemption because she was actually 15 pounds underweight at the time. And she ended up being an incredibly decorated naval officer, and also invented the programming language, the early programming language, COBOL, if anyone has used that, old enough to have used that. So a living example of course, doing things as they've always done. If they always just followed the rules in the way they've always done it, then she would never have been able to make these contributions. So ultimately, engineering best practices and forcing them into prescriptive structures ultimately degenerates health in a number of different ways. It degenerates, first and foremost, the underlying health of the organization. And this is a central tenet to how we work with organizations, which is we really focus on what is your underlying health versus what is the simply outputs of your operations. And we'll come back to that. And it degenerates from health because the organization can't respond to an ever-changing environment, inevitable changes that are happening. And we've seen from the start of this presentation how this way of operating is degenerating from people, and primarily viewing them as replaceable cogs. Then means there's no real reason to invest in their development. We can simply replace them, and we're not investing, and therefore we're capping their potential and productivity. And we've seen, again, from the statistics we presented at the start, this is ultimately degenerating from our communities and from our ecosystems and from our planet. So the good news is we see this as a design issue versus an inherent problem that we can't get around. And if it's a design issue, then we can design organizations in a different way. And we need to design in a different way because many of us, all of us, are now working in a situation where we're really working with complex issues, complex systems versus complicated systems. So I want to spend a little time on what the difference is here. So a complicated system is one, this can be anything from sending a rocket to the moon to creating or assembling one of these. And they are inherently complicated. There's lots of pieces to them. There's lots of steps to take. But ultimately, the inputs follow a series of predictable steps where we have predictable outcomes. A complex problem or a complex situation is one in which there's dense interdependencies. We can't really address what all the inputs are, we can't necessarily inventory them. Where we see nonlinear change, where we can't just predict exactly the series of steps that will happen, and this leads to things being quickly unpredictable. So an everyday example is actually baking a cake can be seen as a complicated problem, but if we follow a series of set steps, make some adjustments, we will get a cake in the end. Versus a complex problem would be something more like maintaining a long-term romantic relationship, raising a child. If there was simply recipes to do that, then most of us would probably be a lot more successful in those areas, myself certainly. So if we're addressing complex situations, then this is what really makes us look to living systems. And we have a whole separate webinar and a whole set of, in fact, in our online course, we spend 2 weeks addressing this, really diving into what we really are learning from living systems, but we'll summarize it here very quickly. And first is that we see that living systems have a way of addressing complexity and adaptation and resilience in a way that we haven't seen in any human-created system yet. And ultimately, this is because the one unique aspect of living systems have over the ability of mechanistic systems is the ability to self-maintain or to regenerate their capacity or regenerate their health. So here we say living is equal to regenerative, which is equal to living. And this ability to be living, or the ability to self-maintain or regenerate health, is ultimately not located in any one place in a living system. It is dependent on all the interdependent relationships of an ecosystem, or in our body, or in an individual cell. And so that ability to be living is ultimately decentralized. And that this ability to be alive is in fact an emergent property of underlying health that is also maintaining. And finally, living systems have a unique relationship to what we call the environment, or outside the system, which is that life is both dependent on, but also creates the conditions necessary in its environment to be alive. Again, if you're more interested in really getting into the details of this, we encourage you to join one of our What is Life webinars, or join our online class that's actually starting tomorrow, but we'll talk more about that. So with these understandings of living systems, then we really create a set of principles for human organizations that we design to. And so here is our working definition, or working principles, and these are changing often. But the first is this idea of holism, that everything is interrelated and interdependent. The other is mutualism, that ultimately, yes, there is competition in living systems, but ultimately the greatest, often mutualism and cooperation is actually a stronger force driving living systems than pure competition is. And so mutualism we see as seeing the inherent value and dependence on the other. Uniqueness is another principle that we design to, which is the idea that every individual of an organization, every individual in a living system is original and has an individual genius that it needs to express for that living system to function. The fourth is evolutionary, that everything is changing whether we want it to or not. And so how do we design a situation, design an organization to maintain this dynamic balance with ever-changing environmental conditions? The fifth is what we call nodal, which is the idea that there is not one central place there are all decision-making is happening. There's not one central place where all resources are kept and distributed, but actually there's different nodes in a network that allow for living systems to function. And so ultimately functioning and living is decentralized and distributed. And the sixth is that the idea that similar to evolutionary, but more about the individual members, that we have a focus on being developmental. We have a focus on ensuring the growth and health of all the members of an organization or all the members of a system, not just a few. And so from these principles, we work with organizations to design flexible frameworks to be able to operate from. And we call this the regenerative framework, and we'll introduce it here briefly. But we'll actually start from a place of, if we think of having an issue in our organizations, normally are trying to address those issues. We tend to start here, well, in the column that we call organizational work, right? We say, okay, profits are falling, we need to create new products and programs. Or we're not creating the same impact, or the market is changing, or the funding is changing, so we need a new strategic plan. Or we may focus on, okay, we need to change up our, our technology. We need to move from one platform to another. Or we may just double down on creating impact on a short-term level and getting short-term yield from our current structures. This is where, as consultants, often people are, this ends up often being the first entry point into an organization, is help us in one of these areas. And what we tend to do is to say, we're happy to help you in these areas, but we really want to help on the work, or base that work on some fundamental structures or fundamental aspects of the framework. And the first is focusing on what we call context, which includes the purpose of an organization, but it's greater than just mission and vision. It's really what is the purpose for coming together as an organization versus not coming together. And we also look at what is the inherent quality of life we're trying to create with each other, meaning how does it feel to do this work together? What does it feel like? How do we act in it? Which is the third component of behaviors. How do we need to behave to live into our purpose and our quality of life? And ultimately thinking very mindfully and consciously about what is the environment that we need to both be in as well as help create to be able to achieve that purpose and quality of life. And then a key component is addressing and thinking about the underlying health of the organization. So again, going back to an agriculture metaphor, this would be the equivalent of the underlying soil in a system, right? We can plant a new crop, but if the soil is not functioning, if the soil is not healthy, then we won't get a great yield from that crop. And we think of 4 major components of being the underlying health of the organization. The first is the idea of energy flow, which ultimately is people in an organization. People make up all organizations, and thriving people therefore generate the energy for whatever the organization's purpose is or quality of life. And thriving people need to be able to make decisions and be able to make intelligent decisions. And this is about information cycling. So where, back to the example of the truck checkout process, it's allowing certain systems and certain ideas and certain ways of doing things to die. In fact, to give room, to give life to new ideas and new systems. This is what we call the information cycle. Communication cycle or communication exchange is the idea that different aspects of that organization obviously need to be able to exchange and evaluate and make decisions together. So communication needs to be shared. It can't be siloed in one part of an organization or maintained or have gatekeepers to communication, which ultimately can lead to changes in power of whoever holds that information. And finally, the 4th major component of organizational health is the idea of having a diverse supporting community or looking at diverse networks. This is both internally in the organization as well as externally. Everyone that the organization interacts with is from clients to supply chain to partners to community that it lives in. Then the more diverse that network is, the more resilient we are and the more options we have when changes happen to those relationships. And ultimately then a lot of our framework is about co-designing using the principles we outlined, structures that first and foremost enable the organizational health and create recurring organizational health and allow us to, that are in line with our organizational context, as well as serve as the platform for the work that we need to do. And again, based upon all of those structures, based upon a focus on health, based upon a really shared context, then every organization needs to actually have strategies, have products and programs or services, have the short-term outcomes. But now we've refocused this not as the goal in of itself, but as the outcome of underlying health and of structures that allow health to be created. And when we see an organization operating in this way, this is ultimately creating unlimited potential, potentials that we could not have conceived of at the start, as well as a really strong organizational resilience to changes in ever-changing conditions, and ultimately ongoing and recurring value and wealth creation that is an outcome of inherent health versus extracting from ongoing health. So we are constantly reinvesting back into the health of the system and our organization to create the value and wealth versus extracting from it. And so if we operate in this way, then we are ultimately regenerating ourselves and our organizations. We're regenerating living systems, and we see it as ultimately regenerating the health of our planet as well. And this is just one example. Alex mentioned that we have a deep history with the Savory Institute and a lot of thinking that came from this. And they have operated in this way and created frameworks in this way and applied it primarily to land restoration. And so in the photos you're about to see, this is a grassland in Zimbabwe. There's been no external inputs into this system. There's no seed, no fertilizer. It was simply operating in line with living systems and allowing the potential that's there to ultimately show itself. And over time then, managing this grassland in that way created these outcomes over time. Again, no external inputs, all the seed was there, all the conditions to create that abundance was already there in that system. Or here's an example of an organization in Portland working in this way. They transformed an old used car lot, and by really focusing on what is the inherent health, what is the inherent needs of that community, they transformed this used car lot into a thriving mercado. This was in the Latino area of Portland, a thriving food hall and market that ultimately had incredible outcomes, both economic as well as social, for that community. And so operating in this way, we do recognize means some significant shifts in the perspectives we bring to a workplace, into our management, and ultimately our operations. And this is what we help organizations do at nRhythm. And so we just want to outline some specific shifts that we see in our both perspectives and operations. First is this idea of shifting away from focusing on the underlying parts of a system to really focusing on the whole of the system. And ultimately recognizing that actually there are holes within holes. So if we use our own body as an example, you know, each of our organs is its own holistic system, and together they function together to create the whole of our body. Or if we apply it to organizations, then it's recognizing that what we see as traditional departments may be our whole systems in and of themselves, but they need to be able to interact to be able to function as a whole, as a holistic organization. We see a shift in perspective and behaviors and operations away from dominance to really understanding interdependence. And interdependence is actually something that's very hard to just conceive of mentally. I think we can conceive of dependence, or maybe even two-way dependence between one actor, but we simply add a third person to that situation, and really understanding how decisions and operations function between all those different relationships becomes something we really need to live into. And so they see this as an art and a science and a constant focus on, and here we're focusing on relationships both within the organization, but also between organizations, and this is the network connections we discussed. And this means ultimately really focusing on the development of the whole versus just on the development of a few. We see in a traditional workplace that there is great, investment in certain leaders or the C-suite or the leadership of an organization, but it's much harder to really say, well, how do we create structures? How do we create ownership structures even that really focus on the economic development, human development, and whole organization development of everyone in the organization versus just a few. The third shift we say is moving from the idea of recipes to responses, right? So instead of, this is the idea of moving away from this idea that there's a best practice approach to everything, to really understanding that we need to create the conditions, the information cycling, the communication exchange, the thriving people to be able to respond to unknown situations. And this really means ultimately co-designing for adaptation and resilience in mind versus just creating specific solutions that can work in all contexts, because we know they can't. So it's actually creating solutions that are context specific. Similarly, then, it's about shifting our perspectives from, instead of prediction, knowing the now and trying to predict the future, which we know is limited, into actually trying to see patterns, right? And so this is about really focusing then on creating underlying conditions for health and accepting that even our best, it is impossible actually in a complex environment to really predict the future, right? Even if we look at our economic systems, if we look at our weather systems, we can only really predict maybe a couple days out, or an economic system, a few months. But it's really instead focusing our management to saying, how do we create conditions to respond to something we can't see currently and allow for emergence in the system, allow for emergence in the situation. It's shifting also then away from extracting from people and resources and from the planet to really thinking about equity, right? So that recognizing that ultimately people are the inherent energy source of an organization, and we need to invest in that energy source for long-term thriving. And as I mentioned, focusing on the development of the whole versus the few. It also means moving away from this idea of centralized decision-making and centralized power to really decentralized structures and really empowering all individuals and all nodes in that system to be able to make intelligent decisions and be resourced to make those decisions. So we have a working definition of an organization that operates in this way. We call it a regenerative organization because it is regenerating health of its people, it's regenerating the health of its organization, and it's regenerating the health ultimately of our communities and our planet. So we say a regenerative organization is a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization and organism, actually, where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And we'll end with this quote from the really seminal systems thinker, Donella Meadows, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So Donella Meadows says, the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. So we'll pause there, and happy to take some questions with our remaining time, and then we'll end with some other ideas of what nRhythm can offer as support for you all. Just want to talk about other ways that nRhythm can support. We will announce these. We haven't scheduled them yet, but we'll announce a couple follow-up 30-minute coffee chats. So again, if this is all stored somewhere, planted a seed in your mind, you think of more questions, or you have some follow-up questions on how this work might apply to your context or your own purpose or what you're trying to create in the world, please feel free to join these chats. And that's just a group chat, and we talk with everyone who shows up and talk about how we can support each other in this work. We do have an online course, which is a 4-week course, which allows us to go much deeper into a lot of the concepts we talked about in this. There are 4 hour-and-a-half sessions. And by joining the course, you have access to the recordings if you can't make each one. And we have a lot more, Mark, to your point, we have a lot more interactivity in that format than we do here in the webinar. I mentioned the Organizational Health Index. That's a service that we provide. Again, it's a great starting point for organizations to have a discovery process, to look at their inherent and current state of health, and then how to co-design from that. We also provide a lot of business support, but we do it within our regenerative framework. So we do, if someone is looking for a strategic plan and wants to do it in this context, looking for HR help or a hiring help, operational support, or even financial modeling, we can do that within this context, within these ways of operating. And then ultimately, if you have a specific engagement that you want to combine some of these different services, or provide some training or online, or foundational support, we can design a custom engagement with you as well. So please contact us if you're interested in any of those, or interested in the coffee chats. And then finally, we also want to just let you know, Alex, you want to talk about the Regenerative Earth Summit?
Yeah, so we're a sponsor of the summit, so we just wanted to give it a quick shout out because we thought it might be of interest to you guys. So this is the 3rd annual Regenerative Earth Summit. It's taking place in Boulder, Colorado from October 29th to 30th. And it's a unique convening of global leaders in business, agriculture, academia, and civil society who are dedicated to accelerating systems change to benefit both people and planet. So I encourage you to check it out. I'll include a link to it, along with links to relevant things that Jeff mentioned on the previous slide, and the recording from today in an email, which we'll follow up with in the next couple of days. We'd also, we'd love to have your opinion on this, on how the format of our webinars. So we'll be sending a survey as well. If you have time, we'd really appreciate your feedback on how we can be of service to you in this way. So thank you for joining us today. Appreciate all your thoughtful questions and for participating. And please feel free to reach out if there's any way we can be of service to you. Thanks again.